Hello, my name is Darrell Robert Shune, and on this program I'm going to talk about money and power. And the story I'm going to tell you may be familiar to you, but they probably won't be. And certainly the players that I'm going to talk about, three countries, England, the United States, and Israel, you are all familiar with. But I'm going to approach this subject and how their stories intersect in a way that you may not have heard before. But I want to prove a point, that money and power are two sides of the same coin. And at least on this temporal plane that we live in here. At other levels, money and power are very, very different. But here in this world, they are co-joined. I'm going to tell you two stories. But first of all, the background for this, the two major countries that I want to talk about are the United States and England. Now, in terms of power, England was the largest empire on the planet since the Holy Roman Empire. That's a long time. There was probably a good 1,000 years, 1,200 years between the demise of the Holy Roman Empire and the rise of the British Empire. All right? But when England Empire arose based on its banking system that I've talked about before, it quickly, in a matter of 200 years, became the predominant power on the face of the earth. The British Empire reached its peak in the mid-1800s. All right? And until the end of the 1800s, 19th century, it still was the predominant major power until World War I came along. The Great Conflagration in Europe basically flattened England's power base, and the baton was picked up in the early 1900s, in the early 20th century, by its surrogate successor, the United States of America. Now, this might seem a bit ironic, and it does, considering the United States came into being as a reaction to Imperial England. That it came into being as a beacon of freedom. But what happened in the 20th century, and especially after the mid-century, the United States took up the baton of imperial power that had been laid down by England, though not willingly. If England had had the wherewithal to continue it as a world power, trust me, she would have. But circumstances from the 1850s on had divested England of the great empire which he had achieved in the previous 150 to 200 years. In 1850, England, the sun never set on the English Empire. It stretched all the way from this small nation off the northwest of Europe, all the way across around the world to the crown jewel of England's empire, India. And the saying, the sun never set on the empire, was in fact true. But what happened is, in the latter part of the 19th century, the cost of maintaining that empire, the cost of switching from the greatest navy the world had seen and turning it from wood into metal was not inexpensive. It drained the coffers of the British Empire. The British Empire had stopped expanding, and the two world wars in the beginning of the 19th century basically emptied England's treasury that had been built up over the previous 200 years. And so the United States stepped into England's big shoes in the mid-20th century. So, most of you are more familiar with the United States' reign of global power. Most of you still believe, and the world still believes, that the United States is the sole superpower on the planet. And in one way it is. But let me assure you, just as the latter half of the 1800s decimated England's ability to reign as an economic hegemonic power over the rest of the world, so too did what happened to the United States between 1950 and 2000 decimate the base of the U.S. economic power. And just as the early 20th century shifted the power away from England, so too is the early 21st century doing the same to the United States. But nonetheless, the two powers, what they call the Anglo-American axis, 250 years, 300 years, 350 years, possibly, of geopolitical rule combining the two countries has been unparalleled in recent history. That sets the background for what I'm about to tell you today. The first incident I'm going to talk about is in 1946. It happened in the land then called Palestine. There was no Israel at the time, as we know it today. There was no state. Palestine existed as a British mandate, quote, a British territory after World War II. All right? Basically, through the efforts of Sir Winston Churchill. Now, what happened is that Jews from all over Europe were coming and settling in the homeland, their homeland. For 2,000 years, the diaspora had moved the Israelites, the tribe of Judah, Israel, off of their land, scattered them to the four corners of the earth, and then Hitler and the Holocaust dealt them, perhaps, an almost fatal blow. What happened after World War II with the victory of the Allied powers and through the intercession of Winston Churchill, the British made Palestine basically an open ticket for the Israelis, for the Jews who wanted to go there. Now, the headquarters of the British Protectorate in Palestine was at the Hotel David in Jerusalem. All right? In early 1946, the British had undertaken a series of raids because what they had realized was that Jewish terrorist groups had become ever more violent and were striking out against Arab targets in the Middle East. So the British were trying to bring this under control and end these acts of terrorism. The major party that day's Al-Qaeda was a Jewish paramilitary right-wing nationalist group, Zionist group called the Irgun, I-R-G-U-N. All right? And they knew that the British had significant data on who they were and their background and their complicity in violent acts of terrorism across the Middle East. And so the Irgun decided to blow up the Hotel David. And so they did. On July 22nd, 1946, they had bombs in the basement of the Hotel David in Jerusalem, the nerve center of British power in the Middle East. They blew up the building. 91 died. 46 were injured. A plaque was put down of all places, commemorating that attack by the Jewish version of the Al-Qaeda at that time. And that plaque talked about the heroic acts of the right-wing party on behalf of Israel and blamed the 91 casualties on the British. The British, for not evacuating the hotel. Now, it came to light that in fact that the Irgun actually did perhaps call the hotel at a certain time and tell them to evacuate it. All right? They didn't identify themselves as saying, hey, this is Al-Qaeda, or the Irgun as they were at that time. We're going to blow up the World Trade Center at 9 o'clock this morning, and so please exit the building. There had been a number of such call-in bomb attacks throughout the Middle East. All right? Now, as a matter of record, none of these communiques reached the British at all. And the British, in fact, did not issue an evacuation order. The bombs went off, and 91 did die. About that attack, Clement Attlee, then the Prime Minister, commented in the House of Commons. Honorable members will have learned with horror of the brutal and murderous crime committed yesterday in Jerusalem. Of all the outrages which have occurred in Palestine, and they have been many and horrible in the past months, this is the worst. By this insane act of terrorism, 93 innocent people have been killed or are missing in the ruins. The latest figures of casualties are 41 dead, 52 missing, and 53 injured. I have no further information at the present beyond what is contained in the following official report received from Jerusalem. It appears that after exploding a small bomb in the street, presumably as a diversionary measure, it did virtually no damage. A lorry drove up to the tradesman entrance of the King David Hotel, and the occupants, after holding up the staff at pistol point, entered the kitchen premises carrying a number of milk cans. At some stage of the proceedings, they shot and seriously wounded a British soldier who attempted to interfere with them. All available information so far is the effect that these were Jews. Somewhere in the basement of the hotel, they planted bombs which went off shortly afterwards, and they appeared to have made good their attempt. That was a statement of the British Prime Minister Clement Attlee to the House of Commons in 1946. An attack on the British Empire, with British soldiers personally attacked, casualties in the hotel, 1946. What did Britain do after it issued this report, this specious attack, regarding this terrorist group, the then version of Al-Qaeda? It did nothing. It did nothing. Now, let us fast forward to another incident. This incident happened in 1967 on June 8th. It happened to a U.S. surveillance ship called the USS Liberty. It was patrolling in international waters. International waters. And without warning or justification, the air and naval forces of Israel attacked the ship with rockets, cannonry. 34 naval officers, naval seamen were killed in action. 173 were wounded. The USS Liberty, soon after the attack, radioed for help from the USS Saratoga, an aircraft carrier in the Mediterranean. Fighters were dispatched from the Saratoga in response to this cry of help from the USS Liberty. Midway on their flight to come to the assistance of U.S. military under direct attack, a phone call from Lyndon Baines Johnson and Robert McNamara to the head of the Mediterranean Fleet ordered those fighters to return to their ship. The Israelis had come in to finish the kill and sink the USS Liberty, but they realized they had been spotted by U.S. forces and identified as Israeli military. And they returned. This is the United States. The year 1967. We were the reigning world power at that time, just as Britain had been the reigning world power in the 19th century. And what did the United States do about that act of war? Like Britain, like England, in 1946, with the bombing at the Hotel David, the United States did nothing. Israel tried to say at first about the attack on the USS Liberty, it was an attack of mistaken identity. Now, when I first heard about this, I went up to corroborate some of the facts on the web, typed in USS Liberty, and let me tell you, if you go up there today, you're going to see a very different version up there on Wikipedia. All right? The basic facts are there, but they're buried beneath excuses put forth by the State of Israel, none of which were proved, about their version of the story and what happened. All right? The United States Admiral, Naval Admiral at the time, Thomas Moore, as a part of a neutral study, studied this for a year and came to the conclusion the unprovoked attacks were done on purpose by the State of Israel, probably as an attempt to draw the United States into its war with the Arab states. They were trying to make it look like that the ship, the USS Liberty, was attacked by Egyptian forces. And if the story was bought and sold as planned, the United States would enter into the war on the side of the Israelis against the Arabs because of the attack. But unexpectedly, it had been interrupted in midstream. Now, what do we have here? We have three nations. One, England, the reigning power in the world from the 1700s to the end of the 1800s. Or let's say to the beginning of the 1900s. Its surrogate successor, the United States, the reigning world power from the mid-1900s up until today. All right? Both attacked by a nation that didn't even exist in 1946. Attacked by a people then. All right? Violently. Facts undisputed. All right? Undisputed. And in 1967, when the United States was also attacked with casualties, the facts are disputed, but much like bankers dispute the facts that they were the cause of the 2008 collapse. Certainly, Israel has its own side of the story. But in both cases, it was the perpetrator of two outrageous attacks on the reigning world power. Now, most people go, "Huh, this is terrible. This is horrible." And nothing was done. Nothing was done. And then they let it go. All right? We don't deal with certain things like that. I don't know why nothing was done, but a lot of things happen that we don't understand. But I want to tell you something about money and power. Everything is understandable when you know the whole story. But with money and power, the whole story is kept away from you because money and power much prefers the sanitized version that you read in your newspapers, that you hear on your news, in the dulcet tones of concerned newsmen, giving you their version of what actually happened and leaving out pertinent facts that are really the clues to what really transpired. What these two acts prove is this. Money and power are co-joined. And it's just as much as the United States and England were and are, in various roles, the reigning powers of the last 200 to 300 years. The power of Israel, a very small nation that didn't even exist when their right-wing extreme paramilitary group, the Irgun, then that day's version of the Al-Qaeda, attacked the Hotel David And the state of Israel, the subsequent state of Israel, in 1967 attacked the USS Liberty, which is required by law that the Department of Defense open up an inquiry into, which the Department of Defense has never done and still refuses to do to this day. We're attacked with impunity, with no consequence. In fact, Israel seems to have benefited from this. After the attack in 1946 at the Hotel David, the British Empire, England, the United Kingdom as they call themselves, went and was a sponsor state of the birth of the State of Israel. At the time of the bombings at the Hotel David, Israel was a British mandate. So rather than having their hands slapped, rather than having the terrorists who carried out the attack, one of whom was Menachem Begin, later the Prime Minister of Israel, Israel made, what do they call that? Cutesy face with Israel and rewarded them with the establishment of the Israeli state. Rather than grab Israel and punish them for what they did to the USS Liberty, the United States did nothing. In the intervening years, gave the State of Israel more and more money, more and more arms, and at the United Nations, the United States and England have been the surrogate protectors of this small nation that has the temerity to attack, physically attack, and inflict casualties on the sponsoring states. Now, what would we say if we had somebody living in the town, the richest and most powerful family in town, and one of the kids, the grandkids, shot at the father and the grandfather, killing some of the servants, and they did nothing? Well, that's what you have today. Inexplicable? Apparently. But not really. Because what I'm going to say is this: money and power are co-joined and are different sides of the same coin. And as much as the United States and England have the requisite power to rule empires on the face of the earth, Israel has the money and monetary influence to snap them off at the base. It is through the British banking system, the Rothschilds, the Lehman Brothers, the Goldman Sachs, the Jewish banking houses that have so much influence over the sponsoring states that co-sponsor Israel's power in the United Nations. And even today, that power still exists. Those so-called young Turks, the Tea Party, the ones who have the guts and the balls to stand up to American establishment, all signed their names on the dotted lines that they would not cut one penny from aid to Israel in the new American budgets. The Tea Party members who will say, we are the voice of an America so strong enough to stand up to the establishment, don't have the balls to stand up to the State of Israel. And they have put their names down in writing, promising the State of Israel that they will cut the budgets of Americans before they touch the budget the United States gives to Israel. Now, I don't know what defines treason. It's a sort of a loose term, applied here and yet not there. Prescott Bush, the grandfather of George Bush himself, raised an army, engaged in conspiratorial activities to bring the United States down. But to me, this smells like treason.